I'd like to look at survey design. The quality of our statistical analysis really depends on the quality of the underlying data. And so if we want to do good analysis at the end, we need to start with good data. There's really a couple of important things that we should look at here. And one is that we need a representative sample, and we've mentioned random sampling earlier, and we will discuss this more soon. But we also need to have a high quality survey. And writing a good survey is an important professional skill. So careful design of the survey instrument is important. You may know what you want, but the respondent could easily misinterpret your questions. And if they are not responding accurately, that will bias your results and will bias your analysis at the end. And so that means we need to think very carefully about making the questions as clear as possible. It's really easy to write bad questions, questions that are confusing, questions that will give us bad answers, bad data, and then make it impossible to give good analysis at the end. So here's an example of a question that looks kind of typical, and on the surface it might seem okay. So it's looking at auto servicing, and when did you last rotate your tires and change your oil? A, 3 to 6 months ago, 6 months to a year ago, or 1 to 2 years ago. There are some real problems here. One is this has two questions combined into one. You could have your oil changed without rotating your tires. You could rotate your tires without changing your oil. These are not necessarily done together, and by combining them, it makes it impossible for most people to answer the question accurately. The other problem is that the answers are not exhaustive. If somebody had their tires changed and their oil changed last week, it doesn't fit into any of these categories. There's no category for less than 3 months. And similarly, for somebody who had neglected maintenance for a long time, there's nothing for over 2 years. There's also another problem for those endpoints, that if somebody had their oil changed and their tires rotated 6 months ago, they could answer either A or B. And if it was exactly a year ago, it could be either B or C. So when we're writing our questions, we really want to think carefully about it. We don't want to combine questions. We want to ask each question separately so that every question just has one answer. And we want to think about all the answers that possibly could happen and make sure that we have an exhaustive set of responses. Another problem is that context can influence responses. Any information given in the survey can change how people answer. For example, if we're doing a survey on snack foods and diet, people are much more likely to report healthier eating habits if they believe the survey is done for Nike or another sports company. On the other hand, they will report less healthy, or are likely to report less healthy snacking and eating habits if they believe that the survey is being done for a fast food company like McDonald's. And so that's one reason that professional surveys frequently don't disclose who is sponsoring the questionnaire. The companies will hire an independent polling firm, somebody like Gallup or Harris or Nielsen, and the company will identify itself, but it could be working for any client, and that is trying to limit the context that would cause people to change their responses. Now, even information within a question can change people's responses. And so if we give people a choice, if we have categories for them to select from, we can have a real problem with what's called scale bias. So let me look at an example of two different scales. So these are surveys really testing this idea of scale affecting people's responses. So it asks people on how much television they watch per day. And there are two different scales. And the left scale, as you hopefully can read, the numbers are pretty short, less than 30 minutes, 30 to 60, and so forth. And the top of that scale is over 2.5 hours. The right-hand scale, used in a separate version of the survey, the numbers are much higher. Right, so the lowest number there is less than 2.5 hours, and then 2.5 to 3, 3 to 4, and so forth. But in theory, right, a respondent should be able to pick their category in either scale. So, for example, if you watched 90 minutes of TV and happened to get the blue scale, the left-hand scale, you would choose the middle response, 60 to 120 minutes. And on the other hand, if you had the other scale and you'd watched 90 minutes of TV, you would choose the top response there, the first response, less than 2.5 hours. Right? So it seems like it should give the same responses. But what happens is the higher scale will push people to report more TV watching. So they did this as an actual study, and they basically split a random sample into two halves that each got one version of this question. And they looked at how many people reported watching over 2.5 hours of television. So on the left-hand scale, that is the people who chose the very bottom response of over 2.5 hours. On the right-hand scale, it is everyone who chose anything but the top response. Right? So lots more options there. And they found that just by changing the scale, they nearly doubled the amount of people who reported watching more television. And so that's something to be careful of. Fortunately, it's something that has an easy answer and one that works out really well for our kinds of statistical analysis that we'll do in this class, is you don't need to give people scales. You can simply ask an open-ended question. Or ask them to give a number, and then it's not biasing them by having a scale that is too low or too high. Right? And so, an open-ended question to get to this same idea would be, how much television did you watch yesterday, if any? More broadly, we want to think carefully about the words we use, because it is so easy to steer people inadvertently, to give us responses that are inaccurate, which will then make our final analysis inaccurate. So just to give a specific kind of example, what we want to avoid are questions that lead people in one direction or another. So if I was asking a question about parking on campus and I had a question, don't you agree that parking on campus is a problem? That's leading people to agree with me, and more people will answer yes than if I worded the same broad question, but if I worded it a little differently. So if I said, you don't think parking is a problem, do you? More people are likely to say no. Right, and so we just want to be really careful that our questions are as neutral as possible. Now, one reason why context and wording is so important is that people don't remember very well about the things that we might be interested in. Broadly, memory is very imperfect. And so that means there's certain kinds of questions that we want to be very careful how we ask. So if someone asked me, how much salt did you buy last year? I could give them an answer, but I know it would be wrong. I know that I bought some salt, but I don't know. It's not something that we buy every week. And so I really have no idea, was it 1 pound or 3 pounds? It's probably less than 10 pounds. But anything more precise than that, I really couldn't honestly answer. And so, for something like salt, where it's a small item and the purchases are infrequent, it's much better to ask about a recent specific period. And in general, it's better to ask about a recent specific period, whether it is purchasing, behavior, studying, spending, exercising. And so asking, yesterday, did you exercise? Or in the last 7 days, did you buy salt? Or in January, have you gone shopping? Right? So these are ways to limit and to, look at things that people, are more likely to remember. Another way to do it, if accuracy is really important, and this tends not to be used in class very much, but I have had students do this, is to ask the respondent to complete a diary. And so the radio ratings send a little diary book, like a little, passport-looking kind of book, and ask the respondents to carry it with them for a week and to fill in the specific time and the specific station that they started and stopped listening to the radio. Again, this is a really accurate way, or a much more accurate way, not necessarily perfect, but it is more time consuming for the respondent and may need a little bit of incentive to keep them on task. Another broad issue is sometimes known as response bias, and this is where the people who answer the questions know the answer but are not answering accurately or not answering honestly. And basically there are reasons why people wouldn't answer honestly, and it's because they usually are trying to look good, perhaps looking good in the eyes of the interviewer. So people often try and choose the answer that they believe is the right answer. They may want to look just good more socially, so people tend to over-report things like how often they brush their teeth, how much healthy food they eat, and they tend to under-report things that are seen as less desirable, like how many hours of TV did they watch, how much pornography did they consume, or illegal activities that they might have been involved in. Right? So there's this social desirability that people, it's going to change how people answer, even if they could answer more accurately. And then sometimes people will either give no response because they are trying to protect their privacy, or they will give a dishonest response if they believe that the question is sensitive. And so that's one reason why the demographic section, so this is the section that includes questions about age or gender, ethnicity, race, income. Now, these are really important questions for all kinds of economics and business studies, but because of that concern about privacy, it's always best to save it to the end of the survey, and that is what nearly all professional surveys do, is ask people about themselves after they have completed the rest of the questions. So, to sum up, surveys should be carefully written. They should then be tested before they're being used to collect the overall data, and then revised to address problems that may have come up. On Moodle, you will find for our class links to a few professional surveys, and you certainly don't need to read through all of these carefully. But if you look at the census information or the American Community Survey, also collected by the Census Bureau, you will find some examples of questions that are used in real-world surveys. Thanks for listening. This has been Chuck Stull.